People talk about love as if it's supposed to be loud. The dramatic moments, the intensity of passion, the big declarations where someone says everything they feel in words that echo. But sometimes, the deepest kind of connection doesn't announce itself. It exists in the person who simply stays, in the stillness that arrives after everything settles, in the feeling of being home without needing to say it out loud. When someone avoidant loves you, that silence speaks with more power than any words could. It's not emptiness, it's a form of faithfulness. For someone who has trained themselves to maintain distance, love doesn't show up as romantic performances or endless reassurance or theatrical confessions. Instead, it develops gradually, almost without you noticing, through the patient construction of emotional stability. For a person who has organized their entire identity around independence and space, love isn't about the intensity of emotion. It's fundamentally about trust. It's not strong feelings that draw them near, but the unusual opportunity to experience emotion without fear. They can feel without panic. They can be vulnerable without bracing for impact. Emotional stability becomes the ground their commitment is built on, and only when they experience that safety will their love become something that lasts. Someone avoidant typically learned early that intimacy brings danger. They absorbed the lesson that closeness means losing autonomy, that being known invites criticism, that opening up means being invaded. So they constructed boundaries not from arrogance, but from the need to protect themselves. When they encounter someone who doesn't assault those walls, but instead honors their timing, they encounter something they've never truly experienced: connection without threat. This sense of security is what creates an opening for devotion. The more they sense that their independence isn't being dismantled, the more naturally they begin inviting you into their private world. It's not about pursuing them or convincing them to stay. It's about building an environment where their defenses become unnecessary. Emotional stability with an avoidant person develops through steadiness, not dramatic intensity. They're always observing. They watch how you navigate disagreement, whether you respect their need for solitude, how you respond when they're silent. If you can remain grounded during those moments, something shifts inside them. They start to see that love doesn't require chaos. That realization heals something ancient within them. For potentially the first time, they recognize that love can happen without them disappearing inside it. That quiet knowing gradually enables them to share what they've kept hidden: their attention, their internal world, ultimately their emotions. When an avoidant person begins to feel protected, subtle but meaningful shifts occur. They reach out first more regularly. They mention small details from their day. They become less guarded in your presence instead of performing or defending. What might appear unremarkable to someone else, a message in the morning, a suggestion to spend time together, a rare admission about something they fear, constitutes genuine acts of trust for them. For someone avoidant, these expressions mean more than any grand romantic gesture. They communicate, you feel safe, and that particular feeling represents the most profound way they know how to say, I love you. This version of commitment operates differently from conventional love stories. It doesn't come wrapped in constant physical affection or regular verbal affirmations. Instead, it reveals itself through dependability. When they commit, they're not simply agreeing to care for you. They're committing to staying emotionally available even when every instinct pushes them toward retreat. They're choosing to expose their most protected aspects because the relationship justifies that exposure. It's not an easy decision for them, and it never happens quickly. But once it does, that commitment runs deep. How an avoidant person expresses forever isn't through promises. It's through being there. When they permit you into their world, they're not just occupying the same space. They're dismantling defensive systems built over years. Their love appears quiet but carries real authenticity. They love with substance rather than performance, with reliability rather than drama. It's a love that prefers peace over chaos, security over excitement, genuine understanding over dominance. In this kind of relationship, commitment becomes more than a statement. It's a transformation, an internal shift from being controlled by fear to making trust possible, from existing in solitude to building shared calm. By establishing emotional security, the avoidant discovers the ability to stay. And that choice is the truest indication that they want to build a forever with you. When an avoidant person starts craving closeness instead of escaping it, something significant has shifted in their emotional landscape. People often characterize avoidance as withdrawn, but not because they don't have feelings. Closeness activates an old fear, the fear of losing themselves in someone else. For them, getting near someone emotionally feels like a danger to their independence. Every moment of intimacy triggers an impulse to run, to find isolation where their feelings feel manageable. But when they transition from resisting intimacy to seeking it, something fundamental inside them has transformed. It means love has reached a place of safety where their walls no longer protect them. This doesn't occur suddenly. Initially, an avoidant might still cycle between wanting connection and pulling away. It's an internal battle, a tension between the need to be loved and the terror of being overwhelmed by that love. What alleviates this conflict is connecting with someone who allows them to want both love and autonomy. When they observe that your presence doesn't require them to choose between these things, they start to ease. That initial relaxation is the first stage of real openness. They start understanding that being with you doesn't mean surrendering authority. It means discovering peace in existing alongside another person. For someone who has associated safety with distance, learning to desire proximity becomes revelatory. At first, this shows up small. They want to stay a bit longer. Conversations extend naturally. Silence stretches without needing to be filled. These small indicators show that their nervous system, once oriented toward isolation, is learning to find calm through connection. What once created tension now creates peace. What once triggered avoidance now sparks genuine interest. They start connecting you with stability instead of pressure. This transformation operates at a psychological level. Avoidant people are particularly sensitive to feeling emotionally intruded upon. So, when they begin seeking your presence, it indicates they no longer experience your closeness as invasive. They stop interpreting love as something that might imprison or suffocate them. Rather, they start longing for the grounding that comes from being physically near you. You transform into the emotional anchor they never realized they required. The person they can rest near instead of running from. Their walls don't crumble through confrontation. They dissolve gradually through dependable, patient connection. In these periods, their love starts showing, though subtly. They might reach for your hand, not from impulse but from genuine tenderness. They might disclose thoughts they normally guard or let silence exist without anxiety. For an avoidant, these gestures carry tremendous weight. They demonstrate that they've lost the compulsion to escape. They're beginning to ground their sense of safety not in solitude but in your shared existence. The real beauty here is that it reveals an integration of love and autonomy. When an avoidant seeks your presence, it doesn't mean they've abandoned their need for independence. It means solitude no longer feels like a barrier between you. They can be near without feeling controlled. They can be open without feeling exposed. They're no longer running toward distance, but within connection. Their intimacy is founded on calm, not performance. Ultimately, this movement from avoidance to presence is how someone avoidant demonstrates that their love has developed into something permanent. It's not grand romantic moments or emotional declarations. It's how they consciously choose to be near you, not because they must, but because they genuinely want to. Their quiet companionship, their steady faithfulness, their discovered ease in simply coexisting with you, these are the silent communications that they love profoundly. When the avoidant begins seeking you, it means you've become part of their internal equilibrium, the location where they no longer feel the need to flee to experience freedom. When someone avoidant finally reveals what's happening inside them emotionally, it's one of the most meaningful expressions of love they're capable of offering. Through most of their existence, they've absorbed the belief that feelings are risky, that vulnerability opens the door to suffering, that taking care of yourself independently is the only genuine safety. They maintain an internal universe that appears controlled externally but churns internally, a landscape of buried anxieties, unspoken doubts, and emotional isolation. Letting someone else into that world requires a form of trust that feels sacred to them. When they start exposing that inner turbulence, it's never casual. It's an intimate confirmation of emotional commitment, a quiet admission that they no longer perceive you as a danger, but as someone they trust to witness their authentic self. Avoidants survive behind emotional fortification that shields them from others' unpredictability. They've developed the capacity to persist by containing their emotions and displaying equilibrium even while struggling internally. Their requirement for distance rarely comes from rejecting you. It originates from self-preservation. So when they reach the place where concealment becomes unnecessary, when they begin expressing what actually lives beneath that composed exterior, it's because love has softened their reflex to withdraw. It communicates that they've discovered someone whose closeness doesn't intensify their internal chaos but calms it. That person becomes an anchor in their emotional turbulence. This usually unfolds gently. They might disclose something minor, a moment from their past, something they're afraid of, a wound they've carried. To most people, these instances might seem unremarkable, but for someone avoidant, they're transformative. Every revelation represents a methodical dismantling of protective barriers they've maintained for years. The more they're accepted when they're exposed, the more they trust that love can exist alongside being imperfect. They start recognizing that being truly seen doesn't inevitably lead to rejection, that expressing pain doesn't make them defective, that authentic relationship can actually soothe the very fears they've been running from. When someone avoidant allows you to perceive their emotional tempest, it's usually unrefined and rough. They don't reveal themselves smoothly. They falter through their expressions, struggle to articulate their inner experience, and regularly feel sorry for being too vulnerable. But underneath that uncertainty exists something profound: their genuine aspiration to bond authentically. This openness demonstrates that they're not simply attached, but genuinely emotionally present. They no longer want to appear unaffected. They want understanding. They're seeking not perfection, but genuine compassion. Sharing their internal struggle also functions as a way to measure your commitment. They've expended so much of their existence dreading that they'll be abandoned, that permitting you to observe their fractured pieces becomes a test of whether you'll remain. Your response carries enormous significance. When you greet their exposure with acceptance and kindness, they start absorbing a different belief. Love doesn't require flawlessness. Being damaged doesn't diminish their value. This reception enables them to ultimately rest in love rather than battle it. As time progresses, their transparency expands. They begin revealing not just anxieties, but also their actual needs, something avoidants rarely communicate. This is where devotion transforms, because for a person who endured by concealing, being open is the ultimate relinquishment. It's their method of expressing, "I'm trusting you with aspects of myself I can't even trust myself with." At that instant, their affection progresses beyond guarded caring into real emotional union. What makes this beautiful is its straightforward honesty. The avoidant doesn't need to demonstrate love through spectacle. They display it through candor. Their readiness to expose their internal struggle isn't weakness. It's the most authentic expression of their strength. When they communicate their inner storms, they're not requesting you to repair them. They're requesting that you stay. And when you remain, you become not simply their companion, but their tranquility. In that reciprocal exchange of trust and acceptance, affection stops being a battleground. It becomes a refuge. When someone avoidant starts prioritizing the connection instead of just their own emotional boundaries, it represents one of the clearest signs that they love genuinely and regard you as someone permanent. For most of their lifetime, the avoidant impulse is self-protection. Their instinctive reaction is to defend their independence, to prevent opening up from becoming reliance, to keep command over what they experience. Love simultaneously attracts and threatens them. It symbolizes comfort, but also peril, the possibility of disappointment, lies, or being consumed. So when this category of individual transitions from protecting solely themselves to actively defending the relationship, it demonstrates that affection has grown bigger than dread. It signifies that they view the connection not as something potentially ruinous, but as something valuable they want to maintain. This evolution is understated yet remarkable. Early on, avoidants characteristically retreat during disagreement or confusion. Being quiet feels less threatening than discussing things. Space feels more comfortable than having conversations. But as they grow to care more profoundly, you'll observe them starting to remain through difficulty. They might not always articulate their feelings with clarity, but they make effort to prevent needless hurt. Rather than disappearing, they try to fix things. That transformation from escaping to mending is revolutionary for someone whose instinct has consistently been to withdraw. Protecting the connection means the avoidant starts monitoring your emotional experience, not merely their personal limits. They begin noticing how their actions influence you. If they previously dismissed your feelings to maintain their freedom, they now pause before acting. They're learning that protecting their equilibrium also requires protecting yours. Love expands beyond personal survival into protecting each other. This development doesn't arise from sudden change, but from thoughtful attention. They recognize your consistency, your compassion, your capacity to care for them without ownership, and they mirror that care in their manner. This becomes the stage where how they express love becomes less defensive and more accountable. The avoidant begins addressing their triggers differently. When overwhelmed, they may still require space, but they begin communicating that requirement rather than withdrawing silently. When disagreement happens, they start looking for ways to reconnect rather than vanishing. It's their method of saying, "I want to protect what exists between us." This development shows that love is instructing them in a new strength, the capability to remain connected while staying whole. They stop viewing love as a threat to their autonomy, but as something that gives their freedom direction. In many respects, protecting the relationship becomes their quiet statement of forever. They don't use words like always easily, but their actions begin expressing it. They appear when circumstances require them. They stand up for the connection when misperceptions emerge. They begin recognizing how their decisions shape both people rather than just themselves. These aren't elaborate romantic performances, but they communicate reliability. They're how someone avoidant signals that they now experience the relationship as fundamental to their life. This period also unveils emotional bravery. For an avoidant, genuine care is frightening because it makes them exposed to suffering. Yet when they start prioritizing the connection, they deliberately choose love over terror. They recognize that relationships involve exposure, but determine it's worthy of the danger. That determination indicates genuine maturity. The turning point when love transforms from something they manage to something they build. They stop just trying to survive love. They start constructing within it. When the avoidant starts protecting the connection, it indicates they've shifted from solitude to engagement. They're no longer defending their heart from you. They're defending it alongside you. This understated commitment might not be visible externally, but it's experienced deeply between two people who comprehend the language of emotional maturity. Their affection becomes reliable, their energy genuine, their companionship steady. Something that once frightened them becomes something they stand by. And in that quiet act of defense lives the most transparent proof that they're choosing you not for a season, but for a lifetime. An avoidance expression of love doesn't manifest in dramatic language, grand performances, or consistent displays of tenderness. It's understated, real, and genuinely lasting. When they care, they do so in a manner that remains invisible to most, but unmistakable to those who understand the language. For the avoidant, love has consistently been complicated, a combination of yearning and hesitation, wanting and holding back. They've invested so much of their existence believing that closeness equals risk, that when they ultimately permit themselves to stay, their love becomes sacred. It may not resemble the films, but it's a love that persists because it rests on dependability, not extravagance. Avoidants are naturally oriented toward control and emotional distance because it generates stability. They're afraid of relying on others, not from emotional shallowness, but because reliance once symbolized vulnerability they couldn't manage. When they eventually open their hearts, it disrupts their carefully maintained equilibrium. They find themselves caring more than they intended, experiencing more than they're comfortable with, and thinking of you more regularly than they'd publicly acknowledge. Yet even as those feelings intensify, they don't articulate them verbally. They communicate them through steadfastness. They might not say, "I care about you" frequently, but they'll be present when you require them. They might not show affection constantly, but they'll understand what brings you peace, what calms your mind, what holds meaning for your heart. For someone avoidant, loving deeply signifies integrating you into their private world quietly. You'll recognize it in how they adjust their lives to include you without making announcements. You'll perceive it in how they become comfortable with shared silence, no longer requiring distance from another's presence. Their love isn't about proving, it's about maintaining. It's not powered by emotional intensity, but by the steadiness of mutual peace. This is how they communicate, "I'm present," without articulating anything. Their quiet becomes their declaration. When an avoidant loves you permanently, their commitment hides in simplicity. They won't make grand promises. They'll make modest, dependable gestures. They'll honor your emotional space because they comprehend how meaningful solitude is. They'll sidestep unnecessary conflict because peace is how they express affection. They'll make choices that keep the relationship grounded, even if they struggle to clarify their reasoning. Their constancy is frequently misread as disconnection, but genuinely, it's their quiet way of being faithful, the category that doesn't request acknowledgement or reassurance, but discovers completeness in existing alongside you. Their love carries something almost spiritual. Because avoidants navigate love through deliberation, their warmth operates through contemplation and self-examination. They deliberate extensively before acting. They experience deeply before speaking. They honor authenticity above image, substance above appearance. When they decide to commit, it's not spontaneous. It's because they've consciously chosen to permit you entrance. For a person who protects their interior world intensely, this constitutes the maximum expression of confidence. It communicates that they perceive you not as a temporary chapter, but as an enduring element of their emotional existence. This kind of affection doesn't evaporate readily because it wasn't born from temporary excitement. It was constructed methodically. It develops in silence, in genuine understanding, in respecting what each person requires. When obstacles surface, they may temporarily distance, but they consistently return. That return is how they convey "I haven't left." They might not communicate it with emotional theater, but their dependability demonstrates it. They love in a manner that transcends time, physical separation, and misinterpretation because their love doesn't need perpetual novelty. It's anchored in reliance and familiarity. To love in stillness but permanently means they've converted their anxiety about intimacy into a consistent pattern of connection. They no longer regard love as something that fragments their identity, but as something that deepens it. And that realization arrives like something settling into its rightful place, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet correction of direction. When they ultimately love genuinely, it is not born from self-erasure or performance. It is not the result of bending into shapes that feel unfamiliar or unsustainable. It does not require them to abandon their own internal landscape in order to be accepted within someone else's. Instead, it grows from something far more grounded: recognition. The recognition that love, in its most stable form, is not a negotiation. It is not a test of endurance. It is not a system where one person becomes smaller so the other can feel more comfortable. Real love, they begin to understand, does not ask for disappearance. It asks for presence. And presence is a very different kind of offering. Presence does not rush to fill silence. It does not over-explain itself to secure safety. It does not perform certainty when uncertainty is present. It simply remains available, honest, and intact. It allows space for another person's humanity without collapsing under it. And in doing so, it creates a kind of emotional ground that does not shift unpredictably beneath either person's feet. When they stop trying to become something more acceptable, something more adaptable, something more easily loved, they begin to notice something unexpected. Love becomes less complicated, not because people around them change, but because the internal demand to constantly adjust begins to dissolve. There is no longer a quiet negotiation happening beneath every interaction, no longer an invisible calculation of how much of myself should I reduce to maintain connection. Instead, what emerges is steadiness. And steadiness has its own quiet magnetism. It does not demand attention. It does not compete for validation. It does not oscillate between extremes. It simply exists in a consistent form that others either meet or do not meet. And that distinction becomes important because it removes confusion from relationships that were previously interpreted through hope rather than behavior. When someone chooses to remain in that steadiness, when they choose to meet it rather than resist it, something rare begins to form between two people. Not intensity, not dependency, not emotional turbulence mistaken for passion, but continuity. A kind of emotional reliability that does not require constant reinterpretation. And in that continuity, love stops feeling like a question and starts feeling like a shared environment. They realize that genuine love does not grow from dramatic transformation of identity. It grows from the soft removal of distortion. The layers of fear that once dictated behavior begin to loosen. The need to prove worth through emotional overextension begins to fade. The compulsion to chase inconsistency in the hope that it will eventually become stability begins to quiet down. What remains is simpler but far more solid. They begin to see that the rarest kind of care is not the kind that burns intensely and then collapses. It is the kind that remains, the kind that shows up without needing to announce itself, the kind that does not fluctuate based on mood, insecurity, or external validation, the kind that does not require emotional extremes to feel real. To care in stillness is a quiet discipline. It is not passive. It is not indifferent. It is attentive without being consuming. It is present without being intrusive. It is anchored without being rigid. And most importantly, it does not require the self to be constantly edited in order to continue existing within the relationship. When they choose this kind of care, they are not becoming someone new. They are becoming less entangled with distortion, less entangled with the belief that love must be earned through excess, less entangled with the idea that emotional stability is boring or less meaningful than emotional intensity. Instead, they begin to understand that stability is not the absence of feeling. It is the containment of feeling within a form that does not destroy either person involved. And when they remain in that form, when they offer consistency without demand, tenderness without performance, attention without anxiety, something subtle but profound happens. The relationship stops being a place where identity is constantly at risk. It becomes a place where identity can actually rest. That is what makes this kind of love rare, not because it is complicated, but because it is undramatic in a world that often mistakes intensity for depth. It does not demand transformation into something unrecognizable. It demands honesty, presence, and the willingness to stay aligned with what is real rather than what is imagined. And so, when they ultimately love genuinely, it is not because they have become someone entirely different. It is because they have finally stopped abandoning themselves in order to stay connected. And in that stopping, love no longer feels like something they must chase or survive. It becomes something they are finally capable of holding without losing themselves inside it.